Continuing the Great Wheel by Robert Lawson, Chapter 13. Here's what it looks like. Mr. Ferris was right. The next day was a busy one. The morning was given over to a reception and free ride for the city and fair officials, the men who had supplied the financial backing, prominent engineers and scientists, and everyone else of importance. All, of course, with their families. Uncle Patrick, unfamiliar with in his Sunday garb, wandered about in the crowd for a while, but before long found more congenial company in the engine room with Mr. Barry. They were soon joined by Martin Brennan. The guards stood rigidly at attention by their cars. Con, looking over the throng, could identify only one familiar face, that of Mr. Zillheimer. The pork packer was accompanied by his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives and children. All the sons and all their children were large, pink, and scrubbed-looking, all remarkably alike in appearance. They all looked like Zillheimer products, Con thought. The 6 lower cars were opened for inspection, and the entire Zillheimer family wandered into number 1, solemnly inspecting its appointments. The pork magnate confronted Con. "I've seen you before," he announced. "In Ferris's office, the day I decided to put some money into this." Con, who was not aware that Mr. Zillheimer had even glanced in his direction on that occasion, agreed. "Yes, sir," he said. "That was my first day on the job." "You worked on the wheel?" "Yes, sir," Con answered with some pride, "from the bottom of the foundation holes to the last girder on the top of it." "Good job," Mr. Zillmer said. He looked up at the immense network of interlacing rods and girders. "Well built." He went into the car and settled himself solidly on one of the round seats. 2 of the youngest grandchildren climbed into his lap and went to sleep. Mrs. Ferris suddenly appeared. She smiled at the placid domestic scene. "Well, Mr. Zillheimer," she called gaily, "you seem to trust our wheel completely." "Sure," the packer said with a smile. "I don't put money in anything I can't trust. I don't put my family in it either." Mrs. Ferris smiled at Con and touched his arm. "And the little wheel ran by faith," she hummed softly. 1 or 2 aldermen and their wives joined the Zillheimers in number 1. The other 5 cars filled up. Mr. Barry gave a long blast of the whistle. The guards closed and locked their doors, and the trip began. This was Con's first ride as a passenger, and he was surprised by the gentle, soundless movement. Before anyone was fully aware that the car was in motion, they were floating quietly up above the surrounding buildings. When they were 2/3 the height of the towers, there was a few moments' pause as the next 6 cars were loaded. On the 3rd pause, they were at the summit, and even Mr. Zillheimer rose and strode to the windows to admire the view. The whole family lost its pork-like stolidity as the great sweep of the fairgrounds, the city, and the lake unfolded before them. "There's the plant, Pop!" exclaimed the oldest son excitedly. "And there's Lake Shore Drive. There's our house, too, see? With the trees and the pointed roofs." His father grunted agreement. "And there's the stockyards," he added, "so clear you can almost smell them." The 6th stop brought them down just above the now almost empty loading platforms. Great as the throng had been, the huge wheel had swallowed it up easily. Most of the cars were only partly filled. It was noticeable, however, that quite a number of the invited guests had quietly withdrawn and were standing in some small groups, timorously watching the turning wheel. "Quitters," snorted Mr. Zillheimer contemptuously. "Glad to take the profits, but scared to risk their own precious hides. Look at old Peabody there, waiting to see if his meal ticket's going to get killed. Phooey." He made a derisive gesture as the car passed, to which Mr. Peabody responded with a sickly grin. After the last pause, the car made one slow, stately revolution, then began unloading. Con unlocked the north door and automatically recited, "All out, please. Those wishing another ride will please purchase tickets at the ticket booth." "Sure," Mr. Zillheimer laughed contentedly. "I'll take plenty more. Once a week, anyway." At noon, the gates were opened to the public, and once more Mr. Ferris's calculations were proven correct. Thousands were clamoring to ride the great wheel. Long lines of eager customers passed by the ticket booths, and the turnstiles clicked busily. The platforms became packed with people. Every car was filled to its legal limit of 60 persons, yet the completion of each trip found still larger crowds awaiting them. And the people loved it. As each car rose higher and higher, they crowded to the windows, exclaiming over the vastness of the panorama spread before them, gasping at the height, recognizing landmarks with excited cries. True, a few became dizzy or frightened, some children wept, but the smooth, steady movement and the obvious strength and solidity of the huge wheel soon reassured even the most timid. At 6 o'clock, there was a welcome half-hour's halt that enabled the weary attendants to eat their supper. Then the gates were reopened and the crowds swarmed in even greater numbers. The last trip, ending at midnight, found Con almost as weary as any of the hectic construction days. As he sleepily started homeward, he was joined by Martin Brennan. Martin revealed that he had accepted a job in the German village for the summer. Not that he needed it especially, he had quite a bit laid by. It was more in the nature of vacation, with pay. "It is simple and easy," the little man said. "I just sit on a comfortable stool and rake in the cash. They're a kindly, clean people, and it's a real pleasure to be watching how they enjoy their beer and food. From my perch, I have a fine view of all who come and go, the way I might just be seeing your young lady from Wisconsin and directing her to car number 1 of the great Ferris wheel. She'll come," Con said confidently. "She'll come and ride the wheel before the summer's gone." Uncle Patrick left for the St. Louis job, and Con soon settled into the regular routine. For the first few days, the crowds were tremendous. Then they leveled off to a regular, steady flow. On weekdays, the cars were always comfortably filled. On Saturdays and Sundays, they were jammed to capacity. Weekday mornings were the least crowded, and Con was surprised to find that he had several regular passengers. There was an elderly gentleman who appeared at the door of car number 1 every Monday morning on the dot at 9. Immediately the door was open. He strode briskly to the end seat nearest the north door, sat down, and began to read his morning paper. As the car reached the halfway mark in its ascent, he folded his paper, stood at the door, and stared fixedly out at the panorama of the city and lake. Then, as the descending car reached the level of the tower tops, he sat down again and continued his reading. At the end of the trip, he nodded curtly to Con and went on his way. Con never knew who he was or anything about him, but the man never skipped a Monday morning the entire summer. There was an artist who rode all morning every day for 3 weeks. He was making a drawing of the outspread fairgrounds. Con, looking over his shoulder, didn't think much of the drawing. He wondered why the man didn't take a picture of the view with one of those newfangled Kodaks that were becoming so popular, but he didn't like to ask. And there was a tiny little old lady who came every Tuesday morning just before lunch. She carried a small mesh shopping bag from which she always extracted a neatly wrapped sandwich, a small pair of opera glasses, and a notebook. After eating the sandwich, she would adjust the opera glasses and peer out at the birds, pausing occasionally to write something in the notebook. There weren't many birds around, as far as Con had noticed. A few pigeons had taken to roosting in the towers. The fairgrounds swarmed with sparrows. Now and then a gull soared past, but the little old lady seemed to discover much of interest. Each Tuesday, as she left the car, she would fix Con with her nearsighted eyes and state, "Great and wondrous are the ways of nature." There was no denying that, so Con would not nod agreement, and she would pick her way off through the crowd. There were several others who returned again and again, fascinated by the thrilling ride and the wide view. Among them, none was more enthusiastic than Mr. Zillheimer. He arrived at least once a week, shepherding a party of friends, relatives, or customers. He always picked Con's car, usually chatted with him a bit, and at the conclusion of the trip, always unobtrusively forced a dollar bill on him. Con didn't like to accept it, but he didn't want to seem rude by refusing it either. Mr. Zillheimer was so pleasant and friendly. In one of his letters to Trudy, Con wrote, "I'm saving all the dollar bills Mr. Zillheimer gives me. Maybe when I settle down somewhere, I'll be buying a pig with the money. I could give it the name of Zilly." Now that the work was more regular and not too tiring, Con found more time for writing. The unmailed letters in his bureau drawer had grown to be quite a packet. Uncle Patrick's and Mrs. Ferris's comments on the possibilities of housekeeping in car number 1 had set him to dreaming of it in some detail. Often, when the demands of the passengers allowed, he planned likely arrangements. The 2 rows of seats, of course, would have to go. A front and a back door, too, for such a small house, hardly seemed necessary. And if he put the stove at the south end as he planned, it might be in the way of the door. On the other hand, a door there would be very convenient for bringing in the stove wood without tramping through the parlor. Of course, the stove could go halfway down the car against the back wall, but that would divide the space rather awkwardly. Then there was the problem of windows. It was nice to have that many windows. It made things light and cheery, and one could see out in every direction. But it might make things very hot in the summer, and would probably fade the carpet. He'd better ask Trudy's advice. A fellow could be building out a little roof on the sunny side, he wrote, a porch-like, and it would be a pleasant place for the dog and the cat to lie or sit on in the evening, and a good spot for sunning the milk pails. But where to put the stove has me clean bewildered. I would divide off the sleeping room with a curtain that could be pulled across and have a bed the like of a ship's bunk, built solid against the wall. That way in the daytime it wouldn't look like a bedroom at all. Of course, it wouldn't be stylish like the brass beds Uncle Michael has in his flat, but they're clumsy things and make me think of the monkey cage in the zoo. There came a day of thunderstorms and pouring rains. Customers were few, and those who did brave the rain were terrified of the lightning, although assured that the great steel wheel, well grounded in the earth, was the safest place they could find. The lashing rain streaming down the windows made the car cozier than ever and gave Con several more ideas. That night he wrote, "I'll have to be building little porches at the 2 doors to keep out the rain when the doors are opened, and for a place to be wiping the mud off my boots. And I'll be building little gutters on the eaves of the roofs to run the water into a rain barrel. My mother was always saying there's nothing like good, soft rainwater. Just what for I disremember, but anyway, a rain barrel is a handy place to put fish in if you be catching a pond or a stream and keeping them alive in a bucket. The way they'll stay swimming and fresh for days and be right there for cooking when you'd want them. I'm told there's no gamekeepers here in America. And you can be catching the fish in the pond or stream if you've a mind to." In his mind and in his letters, Con gradually built up his dream, the view. There would be no ocean or Kilda Point, but there would be water of some kind, a pond or even a lake, perhaps Lake Michigan. The flowers around the house climbing over the porches, the vegetable garden with no potato blight, a small barn for the cow. "I've even saved it for a cow now," he wrote. "Only one at first, but maybe more later. We could be selling the cream to your Uncle Otto, maybe for his cheese making." Con suddenly laid down his pencil a bit aghast. We, he had written, we could be selling the cream. Of course. He had vaguely realized that all this dream really had been built around around himself and Trudy, but this was the first time he had used the actual word or even fully admitted it to himself. It had always been "I could" or "a fellow could." This might be going a bit too far, taking too much for granted. Trudy doubtless had ideas of her own. She might already be married to some blonde, husky young German. So here's his envisioned farm where he's turned the car into all of these things. Then he laughed at himself. The whole thing was only a dream anyway. It was largely built around car number 1, and car number 1 was an integral part of a huge steel construction, $1 million enterprise, the Great Ferris Wheel. Besides, in all likelihood, the letters never would be mailed. Realizing that, he could write and dream more freely. I remember now that what it was my mother was always saying about rainwater, that it was fine for washing anyone's hair. I'm thinking that after you've washed your hair and it drying in the sun, it would be like that of a golden waterfall flowing down your back. My mother said the rainwater was good for the complexion too, but you'd not be needing that at all. The next day, Uncle Michael and his family arrived from New York.